Welcome to This Explainer. Right now, we're diving headfirst into one of the most polarized, highly emotional debates on the internet today, Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership and the incredibly tangled search for peace in the Middle East. We've been digging through some massive, heavily debated Reddit threads to figure out exactly how people are arguing about this conflict. And just to be clear right up front, we are absolutely not here to take sides. We're here to unpack the anatomy of the arguments themselves. So, let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for This Explainer. We'll start with a thought experiment, waking up as Netanyahu. Then we'll look at the case against Netanyahu, followed by the security counter-narrative and the survivalist theory. Finally, we'll wrap up with debating hypothetical solutions. All right, part 1. Waking up as Netanyahu, a geopolitical hypothetical. So let's kick things off with a pretty wild scenario from the forums. It really forces you to step into what has to be one of the toughest jobs on the planet. Over on the Israel-Palestine subreddit, a user posted this exact hypothetical. Imagine you wake up tomorrow as the Prime Minister of Israel. You keep your own mind, your own morals, but you suddenly inherit all of his powers, his ongoing corruption trial, and, of course, the incredibly messy reality of the region. What on earth do you do? It's a fascinating way to frame the gridlocked reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because, as users in that thread quickly realized, literally every single move you make triggers a massive counter-reaction. To really grasp why this puzzle is so hard to solve, we first need to look at how people actually view the man currently in charge. Which brings us to part 2, the case against Netanyahu, sabotaging a state. The core of this specific critique is the belief that Netanyahu's administration never genuinely wanted a two-state solution. In the thread, critics laid out this whole timeline of actions. They argue he deliberately made life unbearable for Palestinians in the West Bank by expanding settlements, while at the very same time propping up extremist factions over in Gaza. And the logic here? The argument goes that by keeping Palestinian leadership fractured, Israel could basically always throw their hands up and say, hey, we have no unified partner for peace. And to back this up, Redditors constantly pointed to a really controversial quote attributed to Netanyahu from back in 2019. To his fiercest critics, this is basically the smoking gun. They argue it absolutely proves his strategy was to use Hamas as a strategic asset to keep Gaza and the West Bank permanently divided. If you look at it through this lens, the devastating war we're seeing isn't just some failure of security. They see it as the inevitable, tragic result of a highly cynical policy designed to block a sovereign Palestinian state at any cost. Now let's flip the scripts for part 3, the security counter-narrative, managing the impossible. So, where the critics see malicious sabotage, defenders look at those exact same policies and see a pragmatic, realpolitik attempt to manage a literally impossible situation. For example, allowing Qatari money into Gaza. Users on this side of the debate argued it wasn't about funding terror at all. It was actually about keeping the Gazan economy from totally collapsing. Their logic? If Gaza was completely impoverished, it would lead to immediate war. So the strategy, they argue, was just to shrink the conflict, maintain the status quo, and try to buy enough time to build peace treaties with the broader Arab world, places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, mostly to isolate the Iranian proxy threat. The rhetoric used during the current war was also fiercely debated. The original poster pointed to Netanyahu using the word Amalek, which is a biblical enemy of Israel, as clear evidence of genocidal intent against all Palestinians. But man, a lot of users push back really hard on this. They argue that in modern Israeli culture, Amalek is just a specific colloquialism used for incredibly heinous enemies, kind of like equating someone to the Nazis. They insisted that the reference was aimed strictly at the Hamas militants who carried out the October 7th attacks, absolutely not innocent civilians. And when the discussion turned to the truly tragic death toll in Gaza, commenters really wrestled with the numbers. At the time of the post, the health ministry in Gaza was citing over 30,000 casualties. But counter-arguments fiercely disputed the combatant-to-civilian ratio. Users pointed out that the IDF claims up to 13,000 of those casualties are actually militants. What you really take away from this specific debate is how even the most foundational, ground-level facts of this conflict are subject to intense, highly polarizing dispute online. The debate over the looming famine is just as polarized. You have some users firmly blaming Israeli blockades, straight up calling it collective punishment. But then, the counter-arguments point out the absolute logistical nightmare of distributing aid in the middle of a war zone. Users noted that Israel claims Hamas actively steals the aid, and that some Western aid agencies were actually refusing IDF security escorts to maintain their neutrality, which, left the trucks wide open to armed gangs. It's a perfect illustration of how this devastating humanitarian crisis gets viewed through completely different lenses, all depending on who you believe is ultimately responsible for the realities on the ground. All right, moving on to part 4, the survivalist theory, politics over policy. So caught between this extreme polarization, the narrative of the evil mastermind on one side and the pragmatic protector on the other, a third, really nuanced perspective popped up in the comments. Many argued that trying to pin a grand master plan on Netanyahu, whether it's a righteous crusade or intentional sabotage, is actually missing the mark completely. Netanyahu, they argue, is simply a political survivalist. Think about it. He's a politician dealing with a super fractious coalition and an ongoing corruption trial. He basically just shifts his methods depending on which way the political wind is blowing in Israel on any given day. One user actually summed this up perfectly. They argued that his constantly shifting alliances and policies are dictated by one thing: whatever keeps his fragile political coalition intact at that exact moment. Under this theory, he didn't want to pay the massive political cost of making painful concessions for peace. But on the flip side, he also didn't want the huge civilian and political cost of a full-scale war. He just wanted to tread water. But as the horrific events of October 7th showed us, treading water in the Middle East can eventually lead to drowning. Finally, we arrive at part 5, debating hypothetical solutions, the gridlock. Okay, let's circle back to that user who asked what you would do if you woke up as the prime minister. When commenters started actually proposing their own solutions, they instantly, and I mean instantly, hit a brick wall of reality. One person says, just withdraw all troops and end the occupation. Another user fires right back. If you do that, Hamas and Hezbollah will just regroup and launch another October 7th. Somebody else suggests, resign and submit to the international courts. The rebuttal? That might feel great morally, but it does absolutely zero to protect the actual citizens you're now responsible for. Even the idea of bringing in a massive neutral peacekeeping force got shot down immediately, with users pointing out that previous UN forces in Lebanon completely failed to stop Hezbollah from entrenching themselves. If there is one crucial thing you take away from this entire explainer, it's the tragic catch-22 of this region. These debate threads reveal a pretty grim reality. Any action taken to secure peace or security by one side is almost inherently viewed as an existential threat by the other side. If Israel blockades to stop weapons from coming in, it causes massive humanitarian suffering. But if they lift the blockade, they face rockets and terror attacks. If a future Palestinian state is demilitarized, Palestinians feel they have zero sovereignty. If it is militarized, Israelis feel they're facing absolute annihilation. It's an endless, vicious loop. So, we've walked through the fierce critiques of Netanyahu's policies, the staunch defenses of his security pragmatism, and the completely gridlocked reality of every proposed solution. Whether you see the current leadership as the main barrier to peace, a necessary shield in a hostile region, or just a bunch of political survivors, the ultimate challenge is still staring us right in the face. If the very mechanisms of compromise trigger existential terror in the opposing side, how on earth do we break a cycle where history itself is constantly being weaponized against the future? It's a question the internet hasn't solved, and it's one the world is desperately continuing to grapple with. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.